This is my first video update coming to you from Athens, Greece on this Monday morning. Let's talk about some news. Let's start things off with a Wall Street Journal article where they are reporting that Jake the Snake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, has opened up diplomatic channels with the Kremlin, specifically with Nikolai Patrushev, who is, I would say, the second or third most powerful person in the Russian government. The Wall Street Journal is reporting that Jake Sullivan has been engaging in diplomatic back-channel communication with the Kremlin in order to avoid a risky escalation in Ukraine. Now, here is what the Wall Street Journal is reporting. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has been engaged in behind-the-scenes contacts with senior Russian officials in a bid to decrease the chances of a broader conflict over Ukraine, the Wall Street Journal reports on Sunday, citing its sources. According to U.S. and allied officials interviewed by the newspaper, Sullivan has been in touch with Yuri Ushakov, a foreign policy aide to Russian President Vladimir Putin, and with Nikolai Patrushev, who heads Russia's Security Council. The aim of the talks has been to guard against the risk of escalation and keep communication channels open, rather than to discuss a peace settlement for the Ukraine conflict, officials told the Wall Street Journal. The WSJ sources refused to provide details on when the negotiations took place or whether they were productive. U.S. officials said Sullivan has insisted on keeping a line of communication with Russia open, in contrast to other senior White House officials who feel that engagement with Moscow will not be fruitful at this stage. WSJ sources indicated that Sullivan has not only taken a leading role in coordinating Washington's policies over the Ukraine conflict, but has also been involved in diplomatic efforts, visiting Kiev last week to meet with Ukraine President Zelensky. During the talks, the U.S. National Security Advisor urged the Ukrainian leadership to publicly signal that they are ready to resolve the conflict, one U.S. official told the outlet. According to WSJ and earlier media reports, Washington is not insisting that Kiev return to the negotiating table, but wants it to show to the world that it is trying to bring the hostilities to an end. So basically, this Wall Street Journal article is confirming everything that I reported on in my video yesterday. On the one hand, Sullivan, traveling to Kiev, is telling Zelensky to publicly state that he is ready to speak with Vladimir Putin, because according to the collective West mainstream media, the West is suffering from Ukraine fatigue. So we have to get Zelensky to publicly state that he is open to negotiations, that he's ready to speak with Vladimir Putin, and to stop saying that Ukraine will never negotiate with Russia as long as Vladimir Putin is in office. This policy has to end publicly. Publicly, this policy has to end, and Zelensky has to publicly come out and say he's ready for talks. Privately, as the Wall Street Journal is reporting, the U.S. is not pushing Ukraine to negotiate with Russia. That is not the purpose of this public about-face from Zelensky, or at least pushing Zelensky to change his stance on negotiations with Russia publicly. The reason for Zelensky to change his stance on negotiations with Russia is to deal with this Ukraine fatigue, because as the Wall Street Journal is reporting, privately, the United States is not pushing Ukraine to negotiate with Russia. That is what the Wall Street Journal is confirming. So that's the one side of the story. The more interesting side to this story is this back-channel diplomatic communication with Patrushev. According to the Wall Street Journal, Sullivan is one of the few diplomats in the Biden White House who is communicating with the Kremlin in order to avoid a risky escalation. Maybe that's true. Maybe Jake Sullivan is the voice of reason in the Biden White House. But my opinion on this, knowing Sullivan, knowing, or at least knowing of Sullivan, I've never met Sullivan, but knowing of Sullivan, knowing that he comes from the Clinton School of Diplomacy and Foreign Policy, knowing that he is a neocon, I don't buy that he is the one speaking with the Kremlin and communicating with Patrushev in order to avoid escalation that could lead us to World War III. If you believe that Jake Sullivan is the voice of reason in the Biden White House, well, then I have a Greek and Athens Park to sell you. I just don't buy it. I would like to believe that's the truth. I would like to believe that there are sane voices in the Biden White House who are communicating with the Russians and trying to avoid escalation. But I don't think Jake Sullivan is one of those voices. I could be wrong. I could be completely wrong. And maybe Jake Sullivan is the peacemaker, but I just don't buy it. Now, here is what I think is actually going on. I think that Jake Sullivan is indeed communicating with the Kremlin. But I think that Jake Sullivan, this is just my opinion, I'm just speculating here, I believe that Jake Sullivan is telling the Kremlin, if you escalate, as all indications show you are about to escalate, Russia, Kremlin, Patrushev, if you guys escalate as we see that you are about to escalate, well then, we, NATO, the United States, we are also going to escalate in Ukraine. I believe that's the message that Sullivan is relaying to the Kremlin. We see that you guys are about to escalate, he's telling Patrushev. We know it. We know that you guys are about to turn that dial up. And if you do that, I just want you to know, Mr. Patrushev, that we have assembled 100,000 NATO troops, American, Romanian, Polish. They're ready and waiting, and they're going to get involved if you crank things up in Ukraine. That's what I think the message was to the Kremlin. And I think this has given the Kremlin a bit of pause. Rightly so, as they should pause and consider their next move, because the last thing that Russia wants, the last thing that the world needs, and Russia is well aware of this, is a war breaking out between Russia and NATO, Russia and the United States. And so I think that Patrushev and the Kremlin, they are getting these messages from Sullivan, and they're thinking things over. How do we win this war in Ukraine without having it lead to an all-out war between the US and Russia, NATO and Russia? And we've got this Sullivan guy in the NSA telling us that if we are about to escalate things in Ukraine, well, then the US is going to also jump in. And not covert proxy war anymore. We're talking US troops, Romanian troops, Polish troops moving into Ukraine. So I think that is the real diplomatic back-channel communication that is taking place. I don't think Jake Sullivan is communicating with Russia and saying, let's find a solution to all of this, and let's avoid escalation, and let's try to find an off-ramp. Neocons don't do off-ramps. Guys that come from the Clinton School of Diplomacy, they don't do off-ramp. They send warnings. They escalate. They threaten. They engage in chaos and destruction. They don't do off-ramps. Anyway, that's the Wall Street Journal article. I think a lot of it does confirm what I was reporting on yesterday, along with this new information of a Sullivan, Patrushev diplomatic communication back channel. That was a very interesting article from the WSJ. What is going on in Ukraine right now on the ground? Well, let me just talk about Donetsk, the Donetsk Oblast, and Pavlivka, the battle in Pavlivka, which, from what I understand, was just a terrible, devastating battle that took place over the weekend, and that is unfolding in the Pavlivka area. And from what I understand, the reports that I'm getting, terrible losses were suffered from the Ukrainian side of things as well as from the Russian military side of things. Both sides suffered terrible, terrible losses over the weekend in the fight in and around Pavlivka. I think the proper name is Pavlivka instead of Pavlovka, but I'm not quite sure. I'll say Pavlivka. And the reason that things are so hard in this area, why it's so difficult for the Russians to take this area over, is because the Ukrainians have the high ground. The Ukrainian military, from what I understand, they have the high ground in Pavlivka. They're very well dug in. It's heavily fortified, and they've got a lot of firepower, from what I've been getting, from what I've been seeing. A lot of firepower and a lot of artillery, and it's doing a lot of damage to the Russian military as they try to advance on this area. So it was a very, very bad day for the Russian military, a very bad couple of days with regards to losses for the Russian military, a very bad couple of days with regards to losses for the Ukraine military in the fighting around Pavlivka. But I believe that the Russians will take this area sooner or later, but it's going to probably be later. It's going to probably be a very, very slow grind in this area. So that is what is happening on the ground. In other areas, things seem to be pretty static. There is buildup in Kherson, more reports of buildup in Kherson, and more reports of a Ukraine offensive in the direction of Kherson. But I reported this 2 weeks ago that I thought there was going to be some Ukraine offensive in Kherson, and it didn't happen. I believe that Sullivan was in Ukraine, and he is pushing the Zelensky regime to get things moving. So we're going to have to continue to wait and see if we do get this big offensive in the direction of Kherson and Kherson City, which, according to the president of Serbia, according to Vučić, the battle in Kherson will be the decisive battle of this conflict. That is a statement that Vučić gave the other day. Now, I don't take the line that the battle in Kherson will be the decisive battle of this conflict, but it is going to be an important battle in this conflict, if it even does take place, because we've had this on again, off again, this stop and go situation with Kherson. But if this battle does take place, it's going to be an important battle. It's going to be a decisive battle like Vučić claims it's going to be. I don't know. I think Vučić likened it to Stalingrad, and there are a lot of analysts who are comparing the possible battle in Kherson to something along the lines of Stalingrad. I don't know if I would take it that far, but it's going to be an important battle if it takes place. I have to always say that, if it takes place, because I was thinking 2 weeks ago it's going to take place, and then we were thinking 4 weeks ago it's going to take place. But I think Sullivan in Kiev was the final green light, the final push for the Zelensky regime to get things moving in Kherson. Another thing that happened yesterday, another terrible thing that happened yesterday, was more shelling in Donetsk. A lot of damage done in Donetsk. Shelling overnight. A big fire started in a railway administration building, and the shelling was from, at least what I understand, U.S. HIMARS. U.S. HIMARS systems. So Donetsk, the city of Donetsk, is still being shelled, is still being attacked as we speak today, even as Russia is taking out the infrastructure of Ukraine, all of Ukraine. The electric infrastructure of Ukraine is being dismantled by the Russians and is causing all kinds of hardship and damage for the Ukrainian population. The population that is living in Donetsk is still being terrorized, this time by U.S. HIMARS. So that is the situation on the ground in Ukraine. I reported yesterday about a possible refugee crisis coming about because of the destruction of the Ukraine electric grid, and what that means is the destruction of the Ukraine economy. Well, we are getting a report, this time now from the Daily Mail. The Daily Mail, not the best of publications, but they are saying that another 800,000 refugees will flee Ukraine this winter. UNICEF warns as a £350 a month payment to Brits opening their homes to Ukrainians faces the axe. In other words, more refugees are going to be coming into the UK as the Sunak government is winding down the funding to homes to host these refugees. And that's going to be a big, big problem. The new British Prime Minister Sunak intends to significantly reduce aid to Ukrainian refugees and Ukraine itself in the face of a budget deficit. According to the Daily Mail columnist Dan Sales, Sunak and Treasury Secretary Jeremy Hunt have found a £50 billion black hole in the British Treasury that they are desperately trying to fill. And so one of the first programs that is going to get the axe is going to be this £350 a month payment made to British homes so that they can host Ukrainian refugees. And the refugee crisis, as we move along in this conflict, I think the refugee crisis in Ukraine, the possible refugee crisis in Ukraine, is going to start to get a lot more attention, a lot more news flow, because this is a crisis that could break the back of the European Union and of the UK. Because on the one hand, as this article is reporting, the European Union and the UK, they don't have the money and they don't have the resources to deal with the large refugee inflow. On the other hand, the Russians are dismantling the Ukraine electric and energy infrastructure, which is going to lead to a refugee outflow. And the collective West, they don't have the money to pour into Ukraine to find ways to keep those refugees in country or to find ways to repair the damage that is being done on Ukraine's infrastructure. So we're heading towards a very, very bad situation for Ukrainians, for Ukrainian civilians, and for the European Union and for the UK, because they're not going to be able to deal with what's about to come if things continue moving in this direction. The Ukrainian refugees are only going to have two options. They're either going to go to Russia or they're going to have to go west. And so that's what this article is hinting at. This article is basically saying, look, we're going to have 800,000 refugees entering the UK if things continue this way. And the money to support these refugees is just not there. We have a £50 billion pound hole that we need to fill. Otherwise, our economy is going to collapse. And we don't have the money to support the Zelensky regime so that they could take care of these refugees. And here's the interesting part. The Zelensky regime, they understand what's happening. They understand, like the Russians understand, that a refugee crisis in Europe and the UK could collapse the EU and the UK economies. And so the Zelensky regime, what they're doing right now is that they're actually using a potential refugee crisis into the EU and into the UK in order to extract money into Ukraine. And there are various Telegram channels reporting that the office of the president, the Zelensky office, they are actually trying to scare Europe with a winter influx of Ukrainian refugees in the amount of 6 to 8 million people. And they are asking Europe, they are demanding Europe provide electrical equipment, fuel, and an increase in financing in the amount of an additional $1 billion every winter month. We saw the same thing happen with Erdogan in 2015 during that migrant crisis. Erdogan told the European Union, he said, look, I'll hold these refugees and these migrants in Turkey, but in return, I need you guys to pay me. And that's exactly what happened. So Erdogan, to this day, he has these migrants and these refugees in Turkey, and the European Union pays Erdogan a certain amount every year, something like 5 or 10, 15 billion every single year, in order to keep these refugees and migrants in Turkey and prevent them from flooding into the European Union. And Zelensky, he saw this, he sees this, and he says, well, let's just do what Erdogan did. Let's just tell the European Union, look, if you don't want 8 million Ukrainian refugees flooding into Europe, what we need is we need €1 billion every month. We need weapons. We need supplies. We need you guys to fix our electric grid. We need all of these things. Otherwise, you're going to get 8 million Ukrainian refugees flooding into the EU and into the UK. So that's what Zelensky's doing. But the big difference between Zelensky and Erdogan is this. Erdogan didn't have Russia constantly attacking Turkey and knocking out Turkey's electric grid. Zelensky has Russia every single day knocking out Ukraine's electric infrastructure. It's electricity, water, sewage, communications. Erdogan didn't have to deal with that. Zelensky has to deal with that. Europe has to deal with that. The UK has to deal with that. They've really put themselves in such a bind, the collective West. They have really boxed themselves in, and they've put themselves in an impossible situation, because sooner or later, the Ukraine economy is going to collapse. It will crumble. Some people say it's only a couple of months away. I mean, I've heard analysts saying that come January, the Ukraine economy is kaput. When that happens, I don't think there's enough money in the collective West to keep the refugees in Ukraine. And as I've said, there's only two directions for these people to go. There's Russia and there's Europe. Those are the two directions. Anyway, I reported on this yesterday. Now the Daily Mail is talking about this, and I'm talking about this again today. As the months go by, I think the refugee crisis in Ukraine is going to shape up to be a very, very big story. I hope not. I pray that's not what happens, but I think that's the trajectory of things. Anyway, let's do two clown worlds, and we'll wrap up this video. From a very serious story, let's talk about two clown worlds, which are kind of they're kind of serious, I think, actually. Anyway, the first clown world is the head of the Ukrainian Defense Ministry's main intelligence directorate, Budanov is this guy's name, has voiced two options for Russia to end the conflict in Ukraine. And I'm going to put a map now on the screen. Option number one is the division of Russia into 3 or more parts. Option number two is the relative preservation of Russia's territorial integrity with a change in its leadership. I think option number two is what Sullivan is telling Zelensky to not talk about anymore. So stop talking about a Russian change in leadership, at least publicly. So publicly, option number two is off the table, even though privately that's what they all want. But you have option number one, which is the map that I put on the screen. Let me put it up again so you can see it. And that is the division of Russia into 3 or more parts. So a lot of times people talk about the division of Ukraine and how that's going to look. Well, according to Budanov, and actually I think this guy was one of the negotiators way back in March, April, when we were almost close to some sort of ceasefire. Anyway, this guy has put up this map of a divided Russia into 3 different parts, maybe even 4 different parts, depending on how you look at it. You have China, the Chinese parts. You have the Central Asian Republic. This is actually in Ukrainian, but I can make it out. You have the Central Asian Republic, and then you have the Russian Federation, and then you have Ukraine. And I think down below you have kind of like the Caucasus, Chechnya region. So I guess 4 broken up parts. This is the outcome that Ukraine is floating to the Russians, what Budanov is telling the Russians with regards to how they can end this war. Either change your leadership, either regime change, or breaking Russia into different pieces. Both of these options, privately, these are 2 options that the collective West has wanted for a very, very long time. Publicly, option number 2 is off the table. Sullivan told Zelensky, I don't want to hear any more business about regime change in Russia publicly. Privately, these 2 options would brighten up the day of all neocons, that's for sure. The chances of something like this happening, slim to none. That's what I would say, but anyway. That's the first clown world. The second clown world is actually a very sad clown world as well. But it has to do with the destruction of the statue of Catherine the Great in Odessa, the person that founded the city of Odessa. Well, there's been an online vote from officials in Odessa, government officials in Odessa, and the results of this online vote, according to them, have resulted in the statue of Catherine the Great, an iconic statue. I mean, this statue to me defines Odessa. It's called for this statue to be removed, to be taken out of this square. The demolition of a monument to Russia's Empress Catherine the Great will be considered during the next meeting of the city's council. Mayor Gennady Trukhanov announced on Saturday after an online poll on the matter concluded. The official had vowed on Facebook to personally vote for the removal of the statue and for the relocation into a proposed park of imperial and Soviet past. The majority of Odessa residents who voted supported the idea of dismantling the monument from Ekaterinskaya Square. Despite the war that is going on in our country, we have managed to follow a legitimate democratic process, Trukhanov wrote, expressing his gratitude to every inhabitant of Odessa who took part in the voting. Now, first of all, the square is named after Catherine the Great, so I imagine you're going to also change the name of the square if you remove this iconic statue. Second, this online poll was not democratic, nor was it representative of the entire city of Odessa. From what I understand, the amount of people that actually took part in this poll was less than 8,000 people. Odessa's population is 1 million. So from a poll of a Facebook poll of 8,000 people, of which 3,900 supported the demolition of this statue, 2,800 voted to leave it in place. From this stupid online poll, you're going to claim this is democratic, and you're going to claim this is the reason to remove, once again, an iconic statue, a statue that defines the entire city of Odessa, that sits in the square named after the Empress Catherine the Great. The vote among those users having confirmed status, i.e. those who provided proof they actually live in the city, showed an even smaller gap, with 2,900 voting for demolition and some 2,250 supporting the second most popular option. So you see, it's not even 8,000 if you take into account people who voted as confirming they live in Odessa. The number barely reaches 6,000, approaches 6,000. So an online Facebook poll of 6,000 people will lead to the eventual demolition or removal of the statue of Catherine the Great. Terrible, absolutely terrible. The more this goes on, let me try to think what I want to say. Ukraine, with all the statue removal, the more this continues, Ukraine is becoming the collective West, and the collective West is becoming Ukraine. I've actually said this before. As this war continues, and as the collective West continues to support Ukraine and continues to advise Ukraine, the more Ukraine becomes like the collective West, i.e. removal of statues. On the flip side, the more the collective West becomes like Ukraine. Ukraine becomes the collective West becomes Ukraine. And you end up with an entire collective West system's collapse. That is, there we are. I've summed up the entire trajectory of things. Removal of statues, removal of your history, your culture. The person that founded the very city, you're going to remove her statue. And then you're going to have to change street names and names of squares and stuff like that. What are you going to call it? Bandera Square? Oh no, I forgot. We can't call it Bandera Square because, according to the collective West, that ideology, that's fiction. That never existed. That's Russian propaganda. That's Putin propaganda. And on a final note, you know, we always talk about how the Russian military, if the Russians do decide to move towards Odessa, they're going to want to preserve Odessa and make sure that they keep Odessa's culture and statues and monuments and architecture. And I just think to myself, the Ukrainians are removing Odessa's monuments and statues and culture and architecture and history. So anyway, that's my clown world. Not the best of clown worlds, but that's the video, theduran.locals.com. Check out Alexandra's channel. Check out the Duran's channel. Go to the Duran shop. 10% off. Use the code Good Day. And look for us on Locals and on Rockfin as well. We are also on Rockfin. Take care.